from the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
Just the fact that we exist is the magic of statistics. It's an infinitesimally small chance that you and I can exist, so don't wallow in negativity. Be happy.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Gad Saad, author of the new book, The Saad Truth About Happiness, 8 Secrets for Leading the Good Life. We'll talk in depth with him about his new book in just a little bit. First, we're joined by Dr. Tim Dolch. He is Associate Professor of Physics here at Hillsdale College. Dr. Dolch, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
We talk occasionally here on the program about some of the research that you're involved with, and a very neat presentation and some papers written in the last couple of months on a topic involving your research with NANOGrav. And again, we have talked about NANOGrav before, but for people who didn't join us previously, what is NANOGrav? What is the kind of research that happens through that organization?
Well, NANOGrav is an abbreviation for North American Nanohertz Observatory for Gravitational Waves. Now, it has the word observatory in it, but what it really is a group of people at many institutions that have been working together for about 15 years, and I've been on it for about 12 years. And what this group does is that it uses 3 of the largest radio telescopes that we've had here in the US, and it's been observing collapsed stars called pulsars. But those pulsars themselves are actually a galaxy-sized telescope. And that galaxy-sized telescope has finally shown evidence for something called gravitational waves.
This is what the presentation was about. This is what these papers are about. The evidence of the existence of slowly oscillating gravitational waves. So why is that important? How long have we thought they might have existed? And what did NANOGrav tell us about these gravitational waves?
Right. Well, these are ripples in space-time. So when a gravitational wave passes, space itself stretches and all the objects in it stretch back and forth in a characteristic manner that was predicted by Einstein. So this is not the first piece of evidence for gravitational waves in general. They were first detected by the LIGO collaboration back in 2015, which resulted in a Nobel Prize for their 3 heads. However, that's just the beginning of a whole new era in astronomy that doesn't use ordinary light at all. It uses these gravitational waves. And these gravitational waves are far, far slower in their oscillation back and forth than were these gravitational waves detected 8 years ago. So the gravitational waves we have evidence for are slowly churning, much like you might have when you're far out on the ocean. And they're coming from all directions in the sky, and that's why we call them a background of gravitational waves. You could think of them as a background hum or a symphony of gravitational waves. But they're likely coming from all of the supermassive black hole pairs that are orbiting each other from the entire universe. And this is the first evidence we have of gravitational waves from supermassive black holes. And this is really exciting because no one was sure that supermassive black holes even had time to merge yet, given the age of our universe. And it's also really exciting because it's just a confirmation that there really is this whole gravitational wave spectrum, totally different types of gravitational waves. With the LIGO experiment, it was a very, very convincing detection. That's why they got the Nobel Prize. But, of course, it's always comforting if you have evidence for gravitational waves from a totally, totally different direction and method. So everyone who works on LIGO was also extremely excited about this result because it shows that it's not just the quirk of a particular method or detector. This is a whole new era in astronomy. You could even say that this is as radical for astronomy as it was when Galileo picked up his first telescope and looked at the night sky.
As we describe these discoveries and confirming something posited by Einstein years and years ago, this is cool stuff. I mean, this is the kind of work that I would imagine you sort of dreamed that you could do as you went into physics and became interested in astronomy. Our students here at Hillsdale help with some of this research. This is the kind of thing that you dream about doing in the field of astrophysics.
That's right. There are a lot of different areas of physics and astronomy that come together in this. And I've stuck with the collaboration. I was on it first when I was a postdoctoral researcher, right after I got my doctorate, but I kept sticking with it because I really thought highly of the people in this group that I've worked with and the students that I've worked with. They've always benefited from it here at the college. And the science was utterly, utterly compelling because this didn't require a giant facility to build.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of more frontier physics experiments do. These are existing radio telescopes. You just have to watch these pulsars that are already out there. It's like nature gave us the telescope. It's as big as our galaxy. You just have to watch it in the right way. So that's a unique situation that I was fortunate to find myself in. So it's really satisfying to see this very slow but very steady increase in the certainty of this finally with this new evidence.
Dr. Tim Dolch is with us, Associate Professor of Physics at Hillsdale College, talking about this research and these papers on the evidence of gravitational waves. We alluded to the fact that Hillsdale students helped through this process with the research with NANOGrav. There are 2 alumni who are co-authors on one of these papers released on the topic. They've already been cited dozens and dozens of times since its release a couple of months ago. How did Hillsdale students get involved in the research? And clearly, by the fact they've co-authored this study, they're quite involved in this research.
That's right. So a nice thing about this kind of research is that you don't need a giant local facility. We have data from these telescopes, and in various ways over the years, students that I've worked with have been able to work on these data and on related topics in radio astronomy. So several years ago, there was a great need for student observers because in this collaboration, we have many, many hundreds of hours of telescope time every month. And those observations, especially a few years ago, really had to be done in real time by real people.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the more advanced students would log on remotely from the physics department here on campus and actually operate these telescopes. And that was, at the time, Arecibo Observatory, which sadly collapsed since, but also the Green Bank Observatory, which we're still using all the time. And that's the giant radio telescope in West Virginia that's 100 meters in diameter, the largest movable object in the world. And our Society of Physics students has also gone down there and observed on site, which was shown in the presentation at the NSF headquarters a month ago. But what these students did was really essential. I mean, this is taking the data that has now this evidence in it, and they did it for dozens of hours. They would stay up all night and do it if that was when the time became available. So now the 2 students who are on these papers, and there were others who had done it previously as well, but the 2 on these papers were Cody Jessup and Laura Salo, and they're both in physics and astrophysics graduate school, respectively, now at Montana State and University of Minnesota. So they're doing totally different projects now, but this is a real nod and a point of gratitude to them for working so hard on this years ago.
So I'll ask, what's next, but also what's in the past? You've got 15 years of research to get to this point. Is there a next step where the research continues? But also, knowing what we think we know now, the evidence of the gravitational waves, what we're pretty certain about, as you allude to, what can that tell us about black holes? What might that tell us about the universe 1,000 years ago?
Right. So one of the conclusions that was in these papers is that this sea of gravitational waves that we're sitting in is surprisingly strong. And one of the possible reasons for that is that the black holes over cosmic time may have very well been a lot larger and or more numerous than were predicted. So that's a fun one to play with. Why is that? There also may be hints of gravitational waves from the early universe, just shortly after the Big Bang. And that could be also part of the mix in here. And that'll become clear as we keep taking data and keep reanalyzing it every several years. I would say the next big milestone, though, in a future data set is looking for an individual supermassive black hole. So this is the collective hum, sort of, or the collective symphony of gravitational waves from many of these double black holes coming toward each other throughout the cosmos' history. But one of the things that will also probably happen as you just keep up these observations, keep reanalyzing, is that we will probably find a gravitational wave source from a nearby galaxy. Nearby in astronomical terms is still very far, but one that we can pick out of the symphony, sort of a dominant instrument, you could say. And once that happens, that's really exciting because then you can point more traditional telescopes and see what's going on. Because where these two supermassive black holes are getting near each other, there's probably a lot of other activity there. The black hole itself, of course, can't make any light, but all of that hot gas and dust swirling nearby it probably can. So that's something that people will be looking for. That's very likely by the end of the decade.
Dr. Tim Dolch, very cool, very interesting research. Associate Professor of Physics here at Hillsdale College. And those papers, people can find them if they search for them through NANOGrav or, again, the YouTube channel, NANOGrav, on the evidence of the existence of gravitational waves. Dr. Tim Dolch, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thanks so much, Scott.
Up next, Gad Saad joins us, his new book, The Saad Truth About Happiness. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Have you ever been fascinated by the stories of the earliest Christians, wondering how they worshipped and prayed, faced persecution and hardship, and settled theological disputes? It can be daunting to figure out how to proceed beyond reading the New Testament and some of the stories of early Christian martyrs. The result is a significant gap in most people's understanding of how the Christian faith took shape and spread from the apostles through the age of Constantine. That's why Hillsdale College has produced a new, free, online course, Ancient Christianity. Professor Kenneth Calvert is your guide through the first 4 centuries of Christianity. He explains a remarkable story of how the Christian faith emerged from its birthplace in a humble Roman outpost to become the Roman Empire's official religion. You can watch the video trailer for this free course and enroll today at hillsdale.edu/Ancient Christianity. Ancient Christianity is perfect for believers or those curious about the history of the Christian faith. Don't miss this opportunity to learn more about the courage and faith of the first Christians. Join us and enroll in our new free online course, Ancient Christianity, at hillsdale.edu/Ancient Christianity today.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Check out podcast.hillsdale.edu, home of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. There you'll find older episodes of this program and new editions of Imprimis, the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, and Hillsdale Dialogues, all at podcast.hillsdale.edu. We are joined now by Gad Saad. He is host of the YouTube show, The Saad Truth, and also the brand new book, The Saad Truth About Happiness, 8 Secrets for Leading the Good Life. Gad, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And of course, for our listeners, they should know that The Saad Truth is S-A-A-D. It's a play on my my family name.
Yes. So many people have thought about this topic of happiness just among, voices on the right. Dennis Prager, Hugh Hewitt both have books about happiness. Dennis Prager spends an entire hour on his show each week talking about happiness. Why do we spend so much time thinking about happiness? Why can't we just do it?
Well, because we fall into so many traps in terms of how we tackle life in terms of the mindsets that get us all, wrapped up in bile and in negativity. You're exactly right that if you ask people what is the number one goal that they have in life, overwhelming majority answer, I want to be happy. And to that point, it's not surprising that of all topics that philosophers have written about, none have been as pervasive. So think about the ancient Greeks as to write about the good life, precisely because it should be easy to achieve, and yet it is riddled with possible minefields.
You write in the book that happiness is not only a positional emotion, but it is a social contagion. Does that carry through for other emotions, hanging around people who are upset about their job? Does that make you more upset about your job? Hanging around people who are upset about life in general, does that make you more upset about your life?
Exactly. So there's a lot of research that looks at what's called network effects. The idea being that if you map out all of the relationships, social relationships within a network, you have some really interesting contagion phenomenon. So for example, the likelihood of you putting on weight depends on whether your friends, and I think even up to 3 levels, friends has put on weight, precisely because we are a social species. And therefore, whether it be our emotions, whether it be our behavioral patterns, they do tend to, propagate in the way that a virus would, and which in a sense speaks to my previous book, The Parasitic Mind, where I talk about how these mind viruses were spawned on university campus and then spread from brain to brain. So you're exactly right that happiness is a positional metric.
2 big choices in life, the choice in mate and the ideal job. And I want to ask a question about both. Those are big parts of the sad truth about happiness. You say that mate choice is a compensatory process, meaning you can make up for your shortcomings when you choose your mate. My wife and I find this to be absolutely true. I'm strong where she is weak. She is strong where I am weak. We are a great team. Is there something specifically wrong, though, about thinking about doubling down on your strengths, finding someone who is strong in the same places where you are strong?
Right. Well, it's interesting that you use the sentence about the compensatory mechanism there. It's not so much compensatory in the way you used it. You used it in the context of, opposites attract. I may be, introverted, you may be extroverted, and therefore we complement one another. There, what I mean by compensatory is that if you score poorly on a particular mating attribute, so let's suppose, for example, I'm not a tall guy, right? Mm-hmm. And we know that when it comes to physical traits, all other things equal, being taller is better than being shorter. And yet I've been able to marry, some people joke on social media that I've married above my weight class. My wife is a beautiful, attractive woman. Well, I was able to attract this lovely woman because I could compensate for the fact that I'm not a tall man by being socially dominant, by being creative, by being funny, hopefully by being, good looking. And so there are ways by which I can compensate, in this case, literally by my my shortcoming, by compensating with other traits. But to your point about, whether opposites attract or the opposing maxim, which is birds of a feather flock together, it may or may not surprise you that the literature is really quite unequivocal in demonstrating that for long-term stability of a marriage, it's birds of a feather that flock together that is the operative maxim. Now, the next question might be, well, assorting on which feathers? Is it that we have to be the same height or have the same eye color? And of course, the answer is no. What you're trying to assort on is similarity in belief system, in life goals, in values. You really want to assort on those traits. That increases your chances of a happy marriage exponentially.
Searching for the ideal job, figuring out what will make you happy. I talk with students here at Hillsdale frequently who are going through this process as they approach their senior year about what to do next. What will be a good career for me? What will be the ideal job? How do you recommend people try to figure out that question? What they are talented at, what they have fun doing, what might be the ideal job for someone?
Right. Wonderful question. Thank you. So I argue that there are 2 elements that will either impart, great professional happiness to you or not, or misery. So number one, I argue that if possible, of course, I understand that sometimes there are pragmatic realities that don't allow you to pursue my prescription, but if possible, finding a profession that allows you to instantiate your creative impulse is really the ticket to having purpose and meaning in your job. Now, what does creative impulse mean? I could be a chef or an architect or a stand-up comic or a script writer for movies. Each of these people is engaging in the creative act. So that's number one. Number two, any job that allows you or affords you temporal freedom, which is a fancy way of saying I am really master of my schedule. I work very, very long hours, but I never feel constrained because ultimately I'm deciding when to work and on what to work. And contrast that with someone who, say, has a factory job whereby the union mandates when you could take bathroom breaks. Well, that's not very good in terms of temporal freedom. So if at all possible, if you can hit those two metrics, you're well on your way to being professionally happy. So later in the book, I talk about, life as a playground, and it's almost never too late, eradicate regret. So in choosing a profession, if you could immerse yourself in play, right? We often think of, play and work are two different things, right? I don't play at work. I work at work, and then outside of work, I play. Well, I view my scientific career as the highest form of intellectual play, right? I'm engaging in solving a puzzle. There's a bunch of variables in nature. I'm trying to see which of these variables might cause other variables. And so I'm literally engaging in puzzle making. The other thing that I would say about regret is that there are two types of regret in life. There is regrets due to action. I regret that I cheated on my wife and now my marriage is over, versus regrets due to inaction. I regret that I never pursued my interest in the arts and I became a pediatrician. Well, it may or may not surprise your audience to know that over the long run, the regret that looms largest in our psyche is the regret due to inaction. So I would be telling your young students, make sure to engage in anticipatory regret, meaning think about your future and try to choose a profession that won't cause you to sit when you're 85 on the proverbial porch saying, oh God, I wish I had become an artist. And instead I became an accountant and I hate accounting.
So I have a question about that regret section in this great book, The Saad Truth About Happiness, 8 Secrets for Leading the Good Life. And as you explain there, short-term regret is largely about actions. Long-term regret is largely about inaction. And this ties into something I've been thinking about for a while. It's more along the lines of why we are so attached to nostalgia. But is it somewhat proper to say that in the short term, we regret actions because we think, well, this could be very different right now for me if I did this other thing. In the long term, we regret inaction because we know things worked out okay. We know our life went pretty well. And so we say, well, I probably could have done X and things still would have been okay. Even if it was terrible, my life still would have been okay. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. So let's take the short term. I really regret that I was so curt with this particular colleague, right? So your brain flags actions, right, in the short term. But when you're looking in the rear view mirror of your life, the thing that looms the most is the path not taken. I really regret that I talk about this in the book. It's personally relevant. I regret that I wasn't able to fully instantiate my soccer talents because I had a career-ending injury in the Canadian Championships. And so I always, whenever the World Cup comes around, I always have this sense, as you said, nostalgia and this kind of longing of what could have been. So you're exactly right. Our brains code actions in the short term as regretful, things. And over the long term, it's the path that I didn't take that caused me angst.
This chapter about being playful, being fun, being funny, it is, to me, a mindset just as much as anything else. I hosted a radio show, daily radio show for a long time, and I was funny on it. At least people told me I was. And they'd ask, how are you funny? How can you do that every day? And I would tell them, it is a mindset. You have to look at things in a particular way to try to find the way to have fun with them or be playful about them. But it has to be an intentional act. Do you think that's correct?
Yes. So I'll give you just a personal situation that it's quite regrettable that's taking place as we speak. Last week, I appeared on the Joe Rogan show, and I just flippantly, in a jocular manner, we were talking about accents that we either like, linguistic accents that we like or don't like. And I made a critical comment about the French-Canadian Quebec accent. Now, I live in Quebec, and I'm fully Francophone. And I said, a phrase that has become now a trademark of mine, it's that accent is an affront to human dignity. But I've also said that the Beatles are an affront to human dignity. I've said that people who hate Lionel Messi are an affront to human dignity. I've said that musicals are, and I pulled out those tweets. So it's a jocular thing. It's a hyperbolic, kind of bombastic way to express something. That's what makes me, if I may say, a compelling communicator and a compelling author. If you see the hate that I've gotten from Quebecers for having said something so flippant. Now, other Quebecers wrote and said, I thought it was hilarious. I agree with you. The Quebec accent is ridiculous. But boy, what an unhappy, miserable person you must be that you think that the best way to spend your time is to send me violently hateful messages because I made a joke about the accent with which you speak. It's unbelievable. Be playful, be fun, be irreverent. Don't take life so seriously, and you'll be much happier.
Talking with Gad Saad, his book, The Saad Truth About Happiness, 8 Secrets for Leading the Good Life. That's Saad, S-A-A-D. There is something in the book that directly references this show, at least I hope. Cerebral variety seeking, you write, as instantiated via an ethos of interdisciplinarity, yields the good life by helping us address important societal and scientific challenges. This is what we try to do here on the show, is to give people a slice from all across the spectrum of what they might want to know and what they might be interested in. Knowledge for the sake of knowledge in some ways. How does having a broad base of information, of knowledge, and the desire for that broad base helpful to our happiness?
Oh, yes. Well, my entire professional life, let alone the ethos of my life in general, has been founded on that principle, which is life is short, and I want to sample from the full richness of life's buffets. So when it comes to intellectual variety seeking, I'm not a stay-in-your-lane professor. Not only, for example, I don't just publish peer-reviewed papers. I get out there. I get on Hillsdale Radio. I get on Joe Rogan because I can wear many hats while being a very serious professor. Now, if you look at, for example, the topics on which I've published, so I've published in medicine, in economics, in psychology, in marketing, in advertising, and in politics, and bibliometrics, which, by the way, academics would tell you that's the perfectly incorrect thing to do when you're building a CV. You should be a hyper specialist. You should only focus on one thing, keep pumping out papers in that one very small, deep lane. Well, I think life is too precious to do that. There are many intellectual challenges that I find compelling, and I'm going to go wherever those problems take me. And so, of course, it makes me happier to sample from a wide range of intellectual landscapes, because variety matters, right? That's why I talk about, food variety seeking, intellectual variety seeking. We know that variety is indeed the spice of life. And so, yes, sample from the richness of knowledge buffets.
My favorite chapter, I think, in the book is the one on persistence and making the attempt over and over again. I love your description, your story about finally getting to talk to the Stylistics, one of your favorite bands, lead singer for the Stylistics, or how out of essentially nowhere, someone with Burt Bacharach said, yes, we'd like to find a way to have Burt on your show. This goes to something else I talk to students about, which is you will be amazed at what people will agree to do if you simply ask. Why are so many of us perhaps afraid to make that cold call, send that letter? Why are we afraid to ask people for things?
Because people have such a, insurmountable fear of rejection. And this is why when I start that chapter, I talk about, for example, the fear of rejection in the mating market, right? I mean, many species, including humans, have a dynamics, a courtship ritual whereby typically the male is expected to make attempts. and understands that statistically speaking, you're going to be rebuffed on countless occasions. It doesn't matter how attractive of a mating prospect you are, that the reality of the dynamics of human courtship is that you're going to be rejected by many women. But now imagine if my ancestors and yours were deathly afraid of ever attempting a courtship, approach on, then you and I would not be having this conversation. So it is natural for people to be afraid of rejection, but the successful people are those who face rejection, overcome it, and move on. And that's why I have a whole section, if you remember, Scott, where I specifically take the greatest of all times in various fields. So I take Lionel Messi, the greatest soccer player of all time, who was told when he was a kid he's too small and frail to ever be a soccer player. I take the example of Michael Jordan, arguably the greatest basketball player of all time, who was cut from his high school sophomore basketball team. I take the example of J.K. Rowling, who's the Harry Potter author, who was rejected by every single publisher until that one final one accepted her. So there is no human endeavor, there's no story of human excellence that's not replete with rejections and failures. Those who succeed are those who persist.
Gad Saad is with us. The Saad Truth About Happiness, 8 Secrets for Leading the Good Life. You reference this right near the end of the book, and we do see stories about this all the time. The increase in depression among Americans, the increase in loneliness among Americans. Do we all want to be happy? Are there people, this sounds perverse, Gad, are there people who are happier being sad?
There are some who are like that, and regrettably, I know some in my own family, not my family, meaning my wife and kids, but my nuclear family. And there might be several reasons for that. So, for example, some people get sort of an orgiastic pleasure in being the victim. What's wrong? What's wrong? And as a matter of fact, that can become a form of psychiatric disorder. So in my previous book, in The Parasitic Mind, I talk about the disorder, the clinical disorder of Munchausen syndrome and Munchausen syndrome by proxy. So Munchausen syndrome is where I feign a medical illness so that I can garner empathy or sympathy. Munchausen syndrome by proxy is when I take someone who's under my care, a pet, an elderly parent, a biological child, and I harm them so I can get the empathy by proxy. Well, the people who are consistently miserable and make that choice, I mean, it could be several reasons. It could be that they literally have clinical depression, and in which case, fine, there are pharmacological interventions, there's talk therapy you can use, or in some cases, they wallow in misery because that's a way of defining their identity. That's the way that I get attention, right? But because constantly people are saying, how can I help? What's wrong? And so on. But life is so short. Life is so precious that, my God, it's a suboptimal way to live life. Just the fact that we exist is the magic of statistics. It's an infinitesimally small chance that you and I can exist. So don't wallow in negativity. Be happy.
If you are not one of those people and you're seeking happiness, this book could help. The Saad Truth About Happiness, 8 Secrets for Leading the Good Life. Again, that's Saad, S-A-A-D. Gad Saad, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
Up next, Mickey Mattox from Hillsdale's Theology Department will talk to us about Martin Luther as theologian. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Over the past 100 years, America has pursued an ambitious foreign policy directed by faceless bureaucrats. While some of those departures were justified, American foreign policy is shifting. What began as the attempt of a free people to protect themselves has become rule by those who seek to impose their ideals around the globe. But how did we get here? In Hillsdale College's new free online course, American Foreign Policy, Michael Anton has the answers. Anton is a lecturer in politics at Hillsdale College, who served at the National Security Council during both the George W. Bush and Donald Trump administrations, and he'll be your guide through the history of American foreign policy. Learn about the founders' vision of foreign policy and how progressivism and empire have eroded those principles. To enroll today and secure your spot in this completely free online course, visit hillsdale.edu/new course. NEWCOURSE. That's hillsdale.edu/new course.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to find the show on Facebook. Search for the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. We're joined by Dr. Mickey Mattox. He is Flack Family Foundation Chair and Professor of Theology at Hillsdale College. Dr. Mattox, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Talking today about Martin Luther as theologian. We go back a ways for this conversation. Give us a thumbnail sketch. We'll get into more detail, but who was Martin Luther?
Martin Luther was a later medieval German Catholic who was extremely devout, came from a pious German Catholic family, went to college, got educated, became a monk, loved the church, worked very hard, and at some point became quite aware, as many were in his day, of various issues, problems, concerns going on in the later medieval church. The one that really stuck in his craw was the issue of indulgences. I think to this day, if you say the word indulgences in a Lutheran audience, everybody's blood pressure goes up 10 points. Luther was very concerned that later medieval Catholics, people close to him, were getting the idea that they could, in effect, buy their salvation by making a contribution to the church. Mm-hmm. And he thought this was deforming the church's practice of the faith and misleading people. So he wanted to correct that. Indulgences were the church's very best number one fundraising technique. And so it's quite successful, and he managed to spoil a really big indulgence sale from a very important person just very near to him, that is a political figure. And the result was that Luther became a cause. And the Latin term causa Lutheri, the cause of Martin Luther, became a famous legal case then in the Catholic Church because people thought that when Luther protested indulgences, he had called into question issues, for example, like the authority of the Pope. Mm-hmm. And with that having happened, lots of other people became quite concerned. And Luther was in the time of a kind of new technology with the printing press. So word of his 95 Theses regarding indulgences spread very quickly.
Let's continue there with the 95 Theses. If people know about Martin Luther, that's probably the next thing they know. Mm-hmm. What's the significance of these 95 Theses? What do they entail? And why did he pound them to the door?
When our Lord Jesus Christ said repent, he intended the whole life of the Christian to be one of repentance. That's the first of the 95 Theses. The 95 Theses themselves are very complex. These are theses proposed for academic debate by Martin Luther, who at this time is not only a priest, but now also a professor in the little frontier town of Wittenberg. And so he means to hold a public disputation, a public debate about indulgences to try to get to the truth of the matter, and in that way contribute to the reforming of the church. Reforming was something everybody was interested in back then, not only Martin Luther. And so by clarifying indulgences, you could see where the practice might be reformed or perhaps be rejected altogether. And the 95 Theses themselves are extremely complex. I've never tried to teach the entire 95 Theses in either an undergraduate class or a graduate class because they take you so deeply into the technical vocabulary of later medieval theology and history. So the Theses are important primarily as a sort of marker of the beginning of the public career and notoriety of Martin Luther.
There's correspondence between Luther and others as he's thinking about these, what will become the Theses. What are others telling him? What are other contemporaries talking with him about? And is he not getting the answers he wants in these conversations?
I think Luther is looking for clarification as to the power. The Theses are an inquiry into the power and efficacy of indulgences. So what role precisely do they play? The reason this is controverted in Luther's day is because it's just a practice that's developed in the later Middle Ages. And it proceeds mostly by papal decree or just sort of because it's so successful. And it isn't clarified and always made clear in the practice of indulgences how indulgences are connected to the grace of God by which one comes into God's favor. And so Luther wants to make it clear that the grace of God has a kind of primacy as over against anything that human beings do to please or placate an angry God.
On the topic of the indulgences, is the church upset at Martin Luther because there is a doctrinal conflict?
Yeah.
Or, as you alluded to earlier, is it because Martin Luther is attempting to chip away at their fundraising, at the main way of raising money for the church?
Well, can it be both?
Of course it can.
Yes, I think it is both. And it is interesting, in Luther's own territory, the indulgence he protested was not allowed to be preached. So it wasn't being done there. But it was being preached in the territory that belonged to his archbishop. The archbishop was a member of a very famous, very powerful German noble family. And Luther, when he wrote the theses, sent them to the archbishop as well as to his own bishop, together with a prefatory letter basically saying, listen, I'm just after the truth of the matter here. I'm not trying to cause a huge ruckus or anything, and I want you all to know about this because I'm putting out these theses. And Albrecht of Mainz, his archbishop, sat on that for about 6 weeks and asked his theology faculty for an opinion about it. They came back with nothing. And so at a certain point, Albrecht forwarded the theses to Rome and indicated that he thought there was the stench of heresy here. And so it was that response by Albrecht of Mainz that occasioned the Roman response, which came very powerfully. And the response, I think, was difficult because people were basically just saying, listen, the Pope said it. The Pope says we should do this, and the Pope's word is law in the church. And Luther, like many other theologians in that day, thought that was not a particularly compelling answer. Yeah.
Talking with Dr. Mickey Mattox, a professor of theology here at Hillsdale College, about Luther as theologian. Let me ask that. Why is it important for us to understand Luther as a theologian? He was many things, great hymn writer, among other things.
Yeah.
Why do we need to understand him as a theologian?
Well, I think that if you ask the question of Luther's abiding significance, say, or if you ask the question, okay, maybe for Lutherans, Luther might be very interesting, but what about other Christians? What about other people? I would say that Luther is a great theologian, and he's a great practitioner of what I would characterize as spiritual theology. Spiritual theology, Luther's way of thinking theologically, is formed not only by the scholarly traditions he was trained in, but also by the streams of what we call later medieval German mysticism. And these German mystical traditions articulated theology in a kind of different language. It was affective, the language of the heart. If there's any one thing I'd want to tell folks who want to read Martin Luther, I'd say, remember, he's a theologian of the heart. He's always looking down deep to see how your response to God is formed by your own heart or reveals your own heart.
So Luther presents his doctrine of justification by faith alone.
Yeah.
Explain to us what that means and why it's so significant in this conversation.
That is a tough topic. In saying that, I want to observe that Lutherans worldwide have been unable to agree on a shared doctrine of justification by grace and through faith alone, certainly in the 20th century and down to today. Now, you go back to the 16th century, there are statements that Lutherans adopt, typically in confessional writings, where they do have sort of agreed ideas. But developing a doctrine that is really widely shared is a little bit more elusive. I think Luther is also a historical figure, so he's in a kind of a state of movement. So you don't have a Luther with a worked out doctrine of justification by grace and through faith alone in, say, 1515, a couple of years before the Theses. And then you have somewhat different versions of this teaching that will develop through Luther's teaching in the 1520s, 1530s, and so on. But broadly, what Luther wants to say is that God is always not only before us, but also behind us. The grace of God is, as it were, extended to us even while we're sinners. And it's this grace that invites us into a saving relationship with God. And to be in that relationship is all ready to grasp the final hope of the Christian life, that is salvation. So one is then saved, as it were.
You mentioned his continued work past this point in history into the 1520s, 1530s. What does he do after this break?
Luther has a really interesting life. He spends 20 years as a monk and then, really against his own intentions, decides to get married and formally leaves his order, stops wearing his habit, and marries an amazing young woman named Katharina von Bora. The two of them wind up having 6 children. He's 41 years old, and he expresses his own surprise when he says, it's different to wake up in the morning with pigtails on the pillow. And the two of them had just a really great marriage, great relationship. In the meantime, Luther also became a trusted confidant to the political powers in his territory. He's an internationally known figure, easily the most famous person in Europe. There are moments during his life when Luther is maybe the most influential person. He has an amazing capacity for expressing himself powerfully, compellingly in writing. And his writings are just flying all over the place. So he's a busy guy.
And he also does a translation of the Bible into the German vernacular and makes a few decisions about how he's going to do that. What's the effect of that?
Well, Luther, if he were famous for nothing else, would be a milestone in the Christian intellectual tradition just for his work on the Bible. So imagine this, the entire Old Testament in Hebrew. It's the 16th century. There aren't a lot of scientific studies. There have been previous translations of the Bible into German, but they've been done out of the Vulgate, out of the Latin version, that is. And so here comes Luther along. He translates the entire New Testament first, and then over the next 10 years, from about 1523 to 1534, they work on completing the Old Testament translation. And that's just an amazing achievement. And I think the most interesting thing about Luther as a translator is his own capacity for bringing over the idiom of Greek and Hebrew expression into lively German that makes sense to the German people. So the idea then is to make Moses talk like a good German.
In the end, and maybe it's a tough question to answer, would we look back and say in his time that Luther was too Catholic? Was he not Catholic enough? What would his definition, or what for him does it mean to be Catholic?
Well, you can find that Luther will at times eschew the word Catholic. So, for example, in translating the Apostles' Creed, we're going to say Christian instead of Catholic. Luther justifies this on grounds of the meaning of the original term, and to some extent that doesn't really reflect his sort of standing vis-a-vis Catholicism. But at the same time, Luther is creating a kind of division within the church where one side will be understood as Catholic and the other side will be understood with the crazy term Protestant. They're called Protestant because the princes who embraced Luther's reforms protested against the emperor. And ever since then, you have the idea that, basically the Protestant churches are defined by this sort of position of protest. I think what both sides really mean to do is stand up for the Catholic faith as they understand it. And certainly Luther would be one of those.
We're going to come back in a couple of weeks and talk more about Luther, specifically in terms of his role in the Reformation. So
Sounds
stay tuned
good.
for that.
Thank you.
Dr. Mickey Mattox, he is Flack Family Foundation Chair and Professor of Theology at Hillsdale College. Dr. Mattox, thanks for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
You're very welcome.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Tim Dolch from Hillsdale's Physics Department, Gad Saad, his new book, The Saad Truth About Happiness, and Mickey Mattox from Hillsdale's Theology Department. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.